Okay, good morning. So we are doing today Gimel Amud Beis. We're starting with the words Tanan Hassam, about 10 lines from the wide lines. But before we go there, I just wanted to finish off on a point that I made yesterday. Not yesterday in terms of the calendar, but yesterday, the last time we met when we did Gimel Amud Aleph. When we did Gimel Amud Aleph, we ended up discussing a little bit about the Rambam and his position, because the Gemara had said that the ruach that a husband has when he's doing kinoi is mistama a ruach tahira. Why? Because if it was a ruach toma, then how would there be a machlekes about rishus or mitzvah or chayva? There would simply not be any debate. If it was a ruach toma, we wouldn't be trying to engage with that. So mistama, we said, the Gemara said that it had to be a ruach tahira. Then you have a machlekes between the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel that says it's a rishus, and the opinion of Rabbi Kiva that says it's a chayiv. And on that, we pointed out that according to the Rambam, sounds like he's saying that number one, there's a rach taira, and number two, that it is a chayiva, because he says in the end of Hilchos Sotah and also in Hilchos Ishus, the Parak of Daled, that a person has to be mekan his wife, and all the time he has to be mekan his wife, kol adam. And we had asked, how could that be? Isn't that like chayshim b'sherim? Is we say chayshim b'sherim is like a begufay. Is that really what the Rambam is saying? And so I suggested yesterday that based upon the opinion of the Kesef Mishnah, based upon the Beis Shmuel and others, that really what the Rambam is saying, a person has to be mekan his wife. He means it in a musadik way, in a teichacha kind of a manner. Not that's necessarily the best for every marriage, but certainly a suggestion that the Rambam felt that this was not literal kinoi. And we're able to prove that it wasn't literal kinoi because the Rambam is chayshish for the Gemara that we've had on Beis and Beis. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a person shouldn't be doing kinoi beina leveina, because if a person does kinoi beina leveina, it's potentially going to work, because according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Lezer, we in fact say that there could be a kina would be kosher without two edim, just eid echad or ben leveina, and that would be simply insufficient. So if you hold that it's a mitzvah mekani wife all the time, and you hold that it's potentially a good kina for a husband to do it alone without having any witnesses, so then you're stuck in a box. Every time a person's going to mekana his wife, you're going to have real kina. If she's nistater thereafter, then she's going to become us to her husband. And so we suggested that since the Rambam holds of that, Chashash of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that a kinoi ben leveina is potentially going to be valid. He doesn't mention Mechlin Misura. He doesn't mention the idea that one shouldn't be doing it nowadays because of the fact that it could be he's going to be answering her up. He just says that this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Lezer that says that we are chayish for kinoi ben leveina, that that's sufficient. He just holds of that. So if that's the situation, and the Ram holds all the kina you require to do, and he holds that you are chayshish for kina ben leveina, so all of a sudden you're going to have everybody be answering up on their wives. Therefore, it cannot mean that the Rambam is saying at the end of Hilchos Sotah and in there in Paraklav Dal and Hilchos Ishos that he is talking about actual kina. He's talking about some sort of teichacha, making sure that the family is acting in an appropriate fashion. The proof of that, additionally, as the Kesef Mishnah said, was that it says mitzvahs chacham. The Rambam's lashon is mitzvahs chachamim, and if it was a chayv midaraisa from the pasuk that, like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, then the Rambam wouldn't have said it's mitzvahs chacham. He would have said it's mitzvahs daraisa. Additionally, I wanted to prove that this was the case because of the fact that it's the end of Hilchos Sotah, although it doesn't help us for the language of Hilchos Ishos, but in the end of Hilchos Sotah, he's talking about a musar. Right, he uses what I call hortatory language, so therefore it's clear that that's what he's engaged in is mushadika type of things and not anything else. Even in Hilchos Ishus, if you look in the halach over there, it's pretty clear the Rambam is dealing with interpersonal relations as it relates to intimacy and the like, and so it should be understood in that context as well. I would like to make one more point to prove that it has to be um, more like teichacha rather than actual kinoi, because the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that he holds that a person has to be mekana his wife, and the Rambam is then saying it's not a chayva to be mekana a woman who has been hanging around and acting in priestess fashion. No, the Rambam is saying that on the basis of understanding Rabbi Akiva, that every man has to be mekana his wife. Is that what Rabbi Akiva actually held? Chas v'shalom, it's not possible that could be the case. Remember, the Gemara in Ksubas Samach Beis tells us that the Bas Kabbalah Savur, Rachel, saw Rabbi Akiva. She saw he was something special about him. Even though the Gemara told us in Psachim on Memches, the Gemara told us that Rabbi Akiva was mamish was a Memches and Memtes in Psachim, that he's mamish and apikar and Amaretz, and that he wanted to be nashcha the Talmidei Chachamim like a chamor because it breaks etzem, not even like a dog which doesn't break etzem. It doesn't break bones. So Rabbi Akiva was mamish and Amaretz who hated rabbis. And Rachel saw at that time that there was something special about him. What did she saw? I don't know, but she saw something. Maybe that's a sign that even Amaratzim can have something special. And she says, if I marry you, will you go to learn? Rabbi Akiva says yes. So remember, she marries him before he becomes a Talmid Chacham. She marries him when he's an ignoramus, when he's an Amaretz, on the hope that he's going to become something because she saw something special about him. And so then he goes and he's away for 12 years, comes back for an evening and hears, the neighbor talking to her. We more there on Ksubas Samach Gimel, and she's saying, no, I hope he would keep on learning for another 12 years. And he goes away. So now he comes back after 24 years, and Rachel is bowing down, to him. He says, no, 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 and everybody's pushing her away. And he says, no, no, no. Shaliv Shalachem Shalahu, everything that is ours, is yours and mine. It all belongs to her. And then when they sit down for lunch, he says to her, I have to do kinyan on you because you were alone 12 years ago with somebody. Is it Hayatachan? Do you think that Rabbi Akiva ever did kinyan on his wife? It's absurd to mention that. Obviously, Rabbi Akiva, when he says it's a chayva, never understood it as a chayva on every man. It's only on a chayva for a man whose wife is acting in a very priestess fashion. That's the only time he would have been talking about it. So therefore, the Rambam can't be taking the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, saying that it's a chayva, and then changing what Rabbi Akiva actually said, which would be only in a limited circumstance, because Rabbi Akiva obviously himself would never have dreamed of doing kinyan on the woman who actually did everything for him and brought him from being an Amaretz into the light of Torah. So this is how I just wanted to open up the share from another point that I didn't have a sort of a tfisa to mention yesterday. Okay, so now we're up to Tanan Hasam and Gimel and Beis. Tanan Hasam. So really, what we're doing today, the first part of the Gemara over here is really the Gemara from Lamed Aleph, the Mishnah and the Gemara from Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph, and Lamed Aleph and Beis. So Tanan Hasam, we learned the Mishnah later on Lamed Aleph that the Mishnah told us. We already quoted the Mishnah before that said that an Eid Echad is believed when we say that the woman was metama, right? An Eid Echad is believed to say that the woman is metama, not believed for kinoi, at least according to the normative opinion of Rabbi Elazar, not believed for stira, at least according to Rabbi Yeshua. And both of them, however, agree that an Eid Echad is believed to say the woman was metama. So Tanan Hasam learned in the Mishnah that a woman who is attested to by one witness that she was engaged in intimate activity with somebody who wasn't her husband, is going to now not be able to drink. She's going to now be usher to her husband. But then I would have thought that it wouldn't work, that you need to have two aidim. So what do you mean you're coming up with one aid? What? The edis harishana, the edis of stira, is called the edis harishana. The edis of stira, which the isser is not an isser oilam. Why? Because if she drinks, she's not going to be us, or if she drinks and it doesn't do anything, that means she's not obviously guilty, and so therefore, since she's not obviously guilty, she's not us anymore, right? It's the drinking that makes her no longer us or her surviving that ordeal. And so, what do we say about that? About stira, the ede stira, they're not able to be answering her in isser olam, And nevertheless, we still say that it requires two witnesses. So Edis Achrona, this is now the Edis of Tuma. Shai Sarta Isra Olam, and eventually the Sky and Parks Mishnayim. The Edis Achrona, this Edis of Tuma, which is going to answer up Isra Olam, right? And there's no longer an option to drink when you have an aid that says she was actually Nitma. So in that situation, wouldn't they say it's a Kavachomer that you should have to have two witnesses, right? If on the stira aspect, which is not an Isra Olam, I need to have two witnesses. So on the Tum, which is in Israel, shouldn't I for sure have to have two witnesses? It's much more severe, so it should be much more required to have two witnesses. Says the Gemara, Tamulayim ve'ed ein ba, kol sheyesh ba, right? That's what we already learned before. The Gemara said, we darshan from the pasuk, ve'ed ein ba v'yilanis ba, so there was no aid. Aid refers to two. So there was no two aidim. What was there? Whatever there was something. There was one aid, v'yilanis ba, and she wasn't forced. So in other words, it wasn't a situation of coercive intimacy where she didn't have an option, which was bal karcha. No, she was fully engaged. So if that's the case, then she is liable to be asked to turn now to her husband on the basis of one aid. We learned that out from the aid einba, the fact that it said that there was no two witnesses. What was there? There was one witness who attested that she wasn't by force, and therefore she is now also to her husband. So you learn it from the pasuk that even though there will be a kalach to say that since it's an Israel, she require two, but since we have this drasha from the Eid Ein Ba, one witness is sufficient to be mentamar. Says the Gemara, so again, we're quoting now from the Mishnah later on. So we should say that it's a kalach from the Eidus Harishayna, that now that we're saying that one aid is sufficient by an Isra Olam to say that she's Nitma, so now learn it backwards. And let's say, well, if on Eidus Achroina, one aid is sufficient to say she was Tuma, Mitamata, and therefore she's Asr now to her husband. So let's say now that even one aid is okay when it comes to Stira. Because if by the Isra Olam, two aidim are not required, one aid is sufficient. So when it's not an Isra Olam, so one aid should be sufficient as well. Says the Gemara. Let's say that it's now a kavachomer by the two witnesses that you don't need them by the tuma, so therefore you shouldn't need it by the stira. Ma edus achrona shoy sartis. So elam eskemes beid echad manach the edus achrona, the edus of tuma, where there's an isur olam. You're not going to let her to drink. She's not going to become us to the husband if there was one edus that said that she was tuma. So then, Edis Harishana Shana Sarta Israel Edintion Skayim Beveid Echad. So the Edis Harishana, the Edis on the Stira, should also for sure work with only having one aid, because over there it's not even Israel. She always has the option to drink. Now that the one aid is going to say that she was Matama, so then she would just be drinking. She wouldn't become us to her husband. So why don't we say that? Says the Gemara. No, we don't say that. Why? Because Tamalam Kimotza Be'ervas Davar. Because of the fact that we say Kimatzav Erev Asdav. What does it mean? As we've said already a number of times, there's Gzer Shava that we learn out from Tinim Mamnis to other areas, and in this area is the area of Arias. Since by Mamnis, it says in the Edim Shnayim, it says the pasuk says Al Pishnei Edim or Al Pishlosh Edim Yakum Davar. And since it says by Arias Kimotzav Erev Davar, so we learn out Gzer Shava. The two words davar, the teacher, that just like by the dinim mamnas, you require two edim. So to by rice, you should also require two edim. But now, while it's true we have a special drush of edim buff for tumah, that enables you to only have one aid. When it comes to the stira, that's an issue of arayas, which we're going to learn out from dinim mamnas, and that's going to require us two edim. That's the Gemara until now. Says the Gemara, 1 second. So Talmud Kimotza Bo Ervas Davar Lahalanu Em Al Pishnei Edim Al Pishloisha Edim Yakum Davar Ma Davar Amr Lahalan Al Pishnei Edim Afkan Al Pishnayim. Just like over there by Dinim Mamas requires two Edim, so too by Arias it also requires two Edim. Now, at this stage of the Gemara, before we go any further, you would say that doesn't make any sense. Why, if you're if you're having a Gzer Shava of Arias, would you say that it only applies to stira and it doesn't apply to tumah? The answer is no. I do have a gzer shava, and that is going to apply to everything about our rights, right? The kinoi, the stira, everything would require two edim. Now that's my baseline. If I want to now contradict that, if I want to now sort of say, well, that doesn't apply here, it doesn't apply there, I need to have something specific in a specific case. So if my baseline is now I have by Arayas Gzer Shava to the Imam and said it always requires two Eidim, so now I want to change that. I can only change that up in the specific case that I have. I have the Eid Ein Ba, so that's talking about Tumah, and so by Tumah, I'm going to allow one aid to testify, and that will be sufficient. But everything else is still going to require two Eidim, right? So we'll still require two Eidim by the stira. That's not going to change. My baseline at this stage of the Gemara is saying that I require two Eidim for stira because it's like anything else in Arias, which we're going to learn out at Gezer Shavat Dinim Amanis. Says the Gemara. This doesn't work, as we know already, because we have another lima to tell you about where we know the two Eidim, and it's not from the baseline of this Gzer Shava of Davar Davar. Says the more really? You're telling me that the reason that I have a requirement of two Eidim by stira is because of this baseline of Arias? No, mibah nafka. It's not that there's a baseline for Arias that we're now applying to stira. Whatever we learn out there in Parshas Kiseitze about Kimotza Barvas Davar, that is for a separate topic. But when it comes to the Parsha of Sotah, the fact that I need two Eidim for the Kinu and Stira, that's not from the Gzer Shava of Davar Davar. That I know from different. How do I know that? From Ba. What do we say about Ba? Ve'ed ein Ba. There were no two witnesses for the Tumah, and even one witness is therefore sufficient, right? Because the one witness is attesting that it was not forcibly, the act wasn't forcible. But we learn out from that there was no two witnesses when it came to the act of Tumah. When it came to the Kino, when it came to the stira, there you would need two Eidim. That's what the lima was that we had. Said the Gemara, we already learned that from Ve'ed Ein Ba, Bavla B'Kino, Bavla B'Stir and Baile. So we already learned this. We have this. We don't need the Gzer Shava of Davar Davar to teach you this. Says the Gemara, so then why are we saying this Gzer Shava? What is this Gzer Shava doing for me at all? I already know that I need two witnesses, Vikini and Stira, from the lima that we have from Ve'ed Ein Ba, Bavla B'Kino, Bavla B'Stir. I don't need a Gzer Shava of Davar Davar at all. Says the Gemara, Hachinami Kamar. What we're doing here is to teach you something additional. Hachinami Kamar, or as Rashi notes here, Gzer Shava l'milsa achrinin nakat. The Gzer Shava is coming here for something else. Excuse me. Masnisin chisuri mechsar v'hachi g'tanile. Our Mishnah was missing something, right? Again, our Mishnah here is referring to the Mishnah later on Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis. We're missing something in that Mishnah. We're coming to teach you that the Davar Davar Gzer Shava that is in the Mishnah is coming to teach you something else. In other words, the Mishnah said, if you just read the Mishnah on Lamed Aleph without knowing our Gemara, you would think, and without knowing the Gemara there on Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis, you would think, okay, so I have a limud that by stira, by Arias, there's a need for two witnesses, and so too by stira, there's a need for two witnesses. And I know that because of Davar Davar. Now we're clarifying, no. That is true. There is a Gzer Shava of Davar Davar, and it's going to teach me something, which we're about to see. But there's an intermediate stage there, which is the Eid Ein Ba, which teaches me that by Tumah, one Eid is sufficient, but by Kini and Stira, you need to have two Eidim. There is an exception now, or Chsir Mechsra, that what we're trying to say is this Davar Davar, this Gzer Shava that you thought was in the Mishnah, was teaching me that you need two Eidim for Kini and Stira. It's actually not there. There is really a shlav in the Mishnah that you should be putting in. What is that Chesur Max? So it says the Gemara like this. This is what it means to say. Talmud Leimer Ba. This is what it means in Pasuk Ve'ed Ein Ba. Bavla B'Kina Blavla V'Stira. That is Pasha that we know Kina and Stira require to Eidim from the limud from Ve'ed Ein Ba. Now, the Mishnah says that there is a Gzer Shav of Davar Davar, and we thought, based upon the way we read the Mishnah initially there on Lamed Aleph, that meant that it was being learned out of the Gzer Shav of Davar Davar. They need two Eidim for Kina and Stira. Says more no. And now we have an additional point. This is the Chesur Mechsar. V'tuma be'alma beloy Kina beloy Stira. If what happens if you had a situation of Tuma be'alma, an Eid Echad came along and said that Shbrinsa was intimate with Ruvain. So an Eid Echad came along and said that. No Kina, no Stira. V'tuma be'alma beloy Kina beloy Stira. What happened in that situation? Would you believe this Eid Echad? Says the Gemara. How do you know that situation that you don't believe the Eid Echad? Says the Gemara, Nemar Kan, Kimotza B'Erev Davar, V'Nemar L'Halan Al Pishnai Eidim, Al Pishloisha Eidim Yaakov Davar. By Arias it says Davar, and by Dinim Amos it says Davar. Davar Am L'Halan Eidim Shnayim, Afkan Eidim Shnayim. So we do need Davar. Davar, what's it coming to teach you? Nothing to do with Kina and Steer. It's coming to teach you something else. That even though, then when it comes to Eid Echad by Tumah, we believe the Eid Echad after the Kinu and Stira. We believe the Eid Echad to say that she was nitmates, both according to Rabbi Lezer and according to Rabbi Yeshua. But when it comes to a situation where there was no Kinu Stira, it was just an Eid Echad that came along and said that Sprinza was Mizana with Reuven in a non-coercive fashion. So in that situation, we would not believe the Eid Echad. The husband can continue on living with her 100%, no issues whatsoever. Now, I'm not getting into the practical halachas of that one. If the husband believes that Eid Echad, all that, that's not for now. But for our purposes now, we're now using the davar to differentiate from the situation a post-stira woman versus a pre-stira woman, right? A situation where there was no stira that was done, then an Eid Echad is not to be believed, period, full stop. It says only in Eid Echad that she was intimate with Reuven, nothing happens. However, if it's a situation where she's already post-stira, then even an Eid Echad is sufficient. How do we know that post-stira 1 8 is sufficient? That's from the Eid Einba, Kol Sheesh, whatever you had. And how do you know that any woman ba'alma that Eid Echad sees that she was intimate with somebody who wasn't her husband in a non-coercive fashion, that she's not us to her husband, that they can go on living together, no issues? I mean, there might be practical issues, but no issues in terms of her being able to stay married. That's because of the fact that we learn our Gzeir Shava of Davar, that our well, that's the Chesir Mechzer in the Mishnah. Now, before we go any further, I alluded in a more blunt fashion. So if you look, and we go quickly through, if you turn to Beis Amud Aleph, we will come across a machlokes. Maybe I should first mention the opinion of the Rambam before we go and look at Rashi. According to the Rambam, this situation of the Eid Echad that came along and sees that she is being mizana with, Sprinz is being mizana with Reuven. Yeah. So this Eid Echad, he caught them in flagrant delicto. That's what I remember from law school. Yeah. So what happened? So he sees them that they're in this compromising position, and he is a post-stira situation. He goes and tells the husband this is what it is. So she doesn't drink. She now becomes usher to him. Fine. Now, was this Eid Echad testing that during the stira he saw that this is what was going on between Sprinz and Reuven, right? Who the husband, the Baal, already warned her not hanging out with Reuven. Now she was being mistater with Reuven. Now the Eid Echad saw what happened while she was being mistater. Is that the situation? Says the Rambam, sure, that could be the situation, but it doesn't have to be the situation. The Rambam says if the woman had already kinyan stira done to her, let's say in July, and then in August, an Eid Echad comes along and says Shrinza was intimate with Reuven. Not during the steer where we have two Eidim for it. Here there's only one Eid for a Maisa Bia between Shrinza and Reuven in August. The steer happened in September, in July. According to the Rambam, that's no problem. Since she's a post-steer woman, and Eid Echad is believed. Look in the Rambam there in Parak Aleph, Halacha Yadal, I think in Sotah, the Rambam is pretty clear that it's certainly true that you could believe the Eid Echad, even if the Eid is from one of the two Eidim, if he happened to be able to see inside the room or whatever, you could believe an Eid Echad from the Maisa Stira. That's not an issue. But you don't have to be in the situation of the Maisa Stira. What's the challenge with the opinion of the Rambam? Challenge the opinion of the Rambam. So let's say she had the Stira done in July. And then next, next year, let's say, an Eid Echad comes along and says, oh, we caught Sprinz and Reuven in compromising fashion. Is it a year later that's also going to be sufficient? Is there a time limit? According to Rambam, there doesn't seem to be any time limit. so long as she has been done kinui and stira to her. So now she is a compromised position. A single aid can come along and says that he saw her in a compromised full time. That is the opinion of the rabbi. However, if you look at Rashi, Rashi again and again and again says the opposite. According to Rashi, I'll play outside and I'll show you the proofs inside. According to Rashi, the single aid has to be attesting that the Maisa of the Bia between Shprinza and Ruvain happened during the same time that there were two Adim who were testing to the stira. There have to be two Adim attesting to the stira, and at that same time, Ba'isa stira is the lashon of Rashi. Ba'isa stira, there has to be an aid echad. From Rashi, it's not 100% clear. There has to be a third aid. Maybe it's a second aid, or one of the two aidim is able to attest to it. I want to make the argument that it's really a third aid, but I'm not 100% sure that that's the opinion of Rashi. But what's for sure Rashi holds is that it has to be Ba'isa stira. So at the time when the woman is being mistater, and there are two aidim for that, there's also a single aid that is saying that she was actually nitmes as well. That means that if the tumah happens in August and the stira happened in July or whatever time before, it doesn't work. The erecha does not work. That means according to Rashi, the raglayim ladavar that we require is a higher bar. That a single aid is not sufficient to asra up to her husband unless we have mamash raglayim ladavar. The fact that we have a kinu and a steer already and it took place at a different time is not enough. It has to be raglayim ladavar, which means there has to be a stira. That's when the bar goes down from the single aid. But if it's a month later, 2 months later, a year later, so then it's just a single aid who's effectively ba'alma, testifying about a woman that she is mizana. So if there's a single aid who's attesting to such a fact, that is not going to be sufficient to tell me that she's ever asked to husband. You always need two aidim for that. As we say, davar davar. So in the Gemara's lashon, according to what Rashi would be learning, was the Gemara says, "B'tuma ba'alma b'loikina b'loistir d'loy mehemen eid echad." When you have tuma ba'alma b'loikina b'loistir, that you don't believe a single aid. So we explain that to mean pashut. That means a woman who never had kina and stira. According to Rashi, no, she could have had kina and stira, but she didn't have it now. The stira wasn't happening at this moment. The stira is not happening at this moment, and she's considered tuma ba'alma b'loikina b'loistir. That's considered to be somebody without stira. Has to be ba'isa steer. That's how Rashi is learning this lashon of the Gemara. Whereas the Rambam is learning means that a woman who never had kina steer, but if she has it, so then she would become, in fact, asr. So that is sort of a diak in the Gemara itself. Now, if you look at Rashi to prove this point, if you look at Rashi, Rashi tells us back on Beis Amud Aleph. So Beis Amud Aleph, look at Rashi. Rashi says Avo Betuma. It's in the wide lines of Rashi. Avo Betuma. So Rashi says Im Yesh Edim Bekinu V'Stira. If there are Edim for the Kinu and the Stira, V'Yesh Eid Echad Shekilkula B'Stira Sa. And there is an Eid Echad that she was Makakal in that Stira. That's my raya. That Rashi thought maybe there's a need for a third aid, right? But maybe not. It doesn't say Eid Acher. He says Yesh Eid Echad. They don't have a very strong right. Next, look at the next line of Rashi. Dibra Masel Shenit Meis says she was become Tuma Ba'isa Stira, and she became Tuma in that very Stira. Look at the next Rashi. Rashi Minol de Mehemed Eid Echad Bituma Shel Stira, and the Tuma of that Stira. So you see again and again Rashi harping on the fact that we're talking about Ba'isa Stira. Then you keep on going. The Beis Amud Beis. If you go into Beis Amud Beis and you look in the Rashi towards the middle of the lines. The Rashi says in the middle of the lines, Itztrich. So if you look at the end of Rashi, Itztrich on Beis Amud Beis, Rashi says, Ba'ed echad v'heyed shenitma'a be'isa stira. She became Tama in that exact stira. V'roi l'ha'aminai kan shaharei raglayim l'davar. And therefore we believe a single aid. Why? Because there is a raglayim l'davar. Again, my argument to you is that it's an eid acher because Rashi says bo'eid echad v'heid shenitma ba'isa stira shiny. An eid echad, one aid came along. What do you mean one aid came along? It's part of the two eidim. What do you mean bo'eid echad? Again, mashmois that I have from Rashi is that he means an eid acher, but I can't 100% prove it. Like I said, I don't see it necessarily in every single example that Rashi felt that. If we keep on going, we will see that there is another there is another Rashi, and that is the Rashi was looking for over here is where um, the next time Rashi says it that I remember is on Lamed Aleph. So if you go to Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, you'll see that Rashi says in the Mishnah on the Divrei Maskal Ani Ra'isia Shenit Meis. Rashi says Be'oisa Stira. I saw that she became Tamid. The Eidach was saying I saw she became Tamid, and that's Stira. She al pi shnayim edim, which is going according to two edim, Rabbi Shul, Rabbi Elazar, al pi oif haperech, or according to Rabbi Elazar, even with one ed, al pi atzma, etc. But there is an aid that the stira that she was nitmates. Again, the stira is the key. And then look at Lamed Aleph on the base. Look at Lamed Aleph on the base, where Rashi says on the Divrei Maskal, the Tuma be'alma. So Rashi says, "Eid echad shehed al isha shalei kina lo ba'ila." A woman who didn't have kinoi, v'omer nidmeis, and he says that she was mitam. And how do you know they don't believe her? We don't say that the when it comes to the Tumas Isha, we do rely on the one witness, just the Alma. No. Loishna la'afikin loishna b'loikin. It doesn't make a difference if it was African or without kino. Tam loimar v'chiyamin rachmana betuma she'achar kino. When we only believe in eid echad after kino, and v'yesh eid stira shnaim, and there were two eidim on the stira v'eid meid shenit meis sheraglam, and there's an aid, additional aid, either I shouldn't say additional because I'm putting that into Rashi. It doesn't say again acher. He says v'aid, and there was an aid who was made shenitmeis, that she was also nitmeis at that time be'oisistira, because that in fact is when you have raglayim ladover. So I think where this potentially stems from as machlos and the Rambam and the Rashi is in this line of the Gemara. Tuma ba'alma b'leikina b'leistira d'leimehem and eidecham. As that, what does that mean? When we say that just plain tuma without kina, without stira, does that mean without kina and without stira ever? Right? That's what you don't believe. That's the only time, and therefore, so long as you have kina and stira, then you will believe in eid echad no matter what. Or is it eid echad b'lei kina b'lei stira, that we're not believing this eid echad if it wasn't during the time of stira itself? If it was during the time of stira, then we'll believe the eid echad, because then the bar is lowered. There's already reglam with as Rashi says. But if there's just some random situation where there was a stira at one point, but then later on there's an eid echad that says she was nitmeis, then according to Rashi, we will not believe them. The last thing I just want to mention on this point is that the Gemara on Gimel and Aleph that we had, the Gemara told us there are machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. But if you go back up onto the top of the page, the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel told us about 10 lines from the top of the page in Gimel and Aleph. The Gemara said, "B'pnei maha emina Torah, eid echad b'saita." Why did the Torah believe in eid echad when it came to a saita? Sheraglayim ledavar. Right, because there was already a basis. What is the basis? She already had kina and stira, and now you have an eid echad. That says that she was nitmeis. So we're going to believe it. The eid echad means that she nit tameh, and now we have an eid echad that says that she was tameh. I would have thought on this line of the Gemara that we're quoting this time of the Rabbi Shmuel, that this would be the place that Rashi would for sure say, "Oh, here's the example of an eid echad shenit meis ba'is stira." And why doesn't Rashi do it? I showed you already a couple of 3 examples on Beis Amud Aleph. Example on Beis Amud Beis. Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Why is the Rashi right here on Gimel Amud Aleph doesn't say anything? Why does Rashi leave that and let that one go? This would be the key place he should be saying. If the Torah is believing in a single aid because it's Raglayim Latover, he should say ba'is stira. So my argument here I wanted to make is maybe the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, Rashi didn't hear that. Maybe in the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, Rashi did not see that that was the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, and that would give a good. If that's the case, that would then give meaning that it's not ba'is stira, And so if you trust in Eid Echad, so long as she's post-stira, even if it's not Ba'isa stira, like the opinion of the Rambam, that would give a good, strong raya to the position of the Rambam. Because according to the Rambam, aside from the fact that the partial reading of the Gemara is more clear like the Rambam, because the Gemara was very clear. We said a woman who didn't have stira, right? She doesn't have kina or stira, but a woman who does have kina or stira, it's not much any time down or when it happened. So long as she had it, it's over. So this will be another raya then to the position of the Rambam. That in fact, so long as she had post stira, so Eid Echad is believed no matter when it happens, not by stira any time. This is my general zugang on the Gemara until now, and now we have to move on. Zak the Gemara, Tana Rabbana. So the rabbis taught us, Ezu Eidus Rishayna. What does it mean when we said Eidus Rishayna? We already said we're on the last line now in the Gimel Beis. Zu Eidus Stira. That is the Eidus of Stira. Eidus Acharina. What is the Eidus of Acharina? Zu Eidus Tuma. That's what we just said. Eidus Rishayna refers to the Stira, and Eidus Acharina refers to the Tuma. Now the Gemara goes. Now we're on top of Dalad Amud Aleph. The Kama Shir Stira. What is the Shir of Stira? What is the Shir of Stira that we're going to say that the two Edom have to say that she was mistater, right? With this Shrinza with Ruvain for a period, right? This Shir Stira, what we're going to be discussing, is in regards to the limited period. In other words, this is when we're coming here now to discuss in terms of being asar up a woman to her husband. So we're not saying the maximum period or the normative period. We're talking about the minimum period. It's very interesting over here that we have the Gemara says this, the following line, and then we'll go to Rashi and show us Stira and Rashi. Stira I haven't seen anybody talk about, but if somebody knows this, somebody says something about it, let me know. So the Kama Shir Stira, what is the share of the Stira? So the Gemara says Kidei Tuma, Kidei Bia, Kidei Hara, Kidei Akavas Dekel, Div Rabbi Shmuel. What does this mean? So Rashi explains. I'm going to see later on the Gemara where Rashi got it from. So when we're asking now, what is the share of Stira that the two Edom who are coming along into testing? Oh, she was Mistater, Shminza with Ruvain. So they're saying it's Kidei Tuma. It's the amount of time that it would take for Maisa Tuma to have taken place. Again, these are not Edom on Tuma. They're just on the fact that she was in a private room with Ruvain. So now we're explaining, what does it mean when we say Kidei Tuma? We're explaining that means Kidei Bia. That is the amount of time it would take to have an intimate activity. So the Gemara says, what exactly is that amount of time? We're not saying it's a full Bia. It's Kidei Hara. It's the initial part of the Bia. That is the minimum amount of time to make somebody asa. In other words, for purposes of being asa of a woman to her husband, or in this case to make her drink, we don't need to have a maximal time or a normative time. The minimal time of a rayas will be sufficient. So this is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Lezer. So let's just finish this. So what does it mean, hara? Like in terms of the tchilas bia, how long does that take? That's like going around a palm tree. Now, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says what you would expect the top Rashi. Rashi says, as I sort of just pointed out, Mahu k'dei toma k'dei bir, Mahu k'dei bir k'dei arog, k'dei hanon shigas ever b'isem magrim, k'kamashira k'dei kavas dego, sheyuchol ha'adam le'let tzivos hadego. Later on, we're going to see in the Gemara, pedantic kinds of questions about this, but for our purposes now, that is the first opinion. We're trying to figure out the minimum amount of time of stira that will be sufficient to say that she now has to drink or she's usher to her husband. We're saying, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, that is kidei kafas dekel. It's essentially the tchilas bia. It's how long does it take to walk around the palm tree? A few seconds doesn't take a very long time at all. So the amount of time of stira is quite short. Yeah. Then is the Gemara. It's the amount of time that it takes to drink a cup. Now, Rashi explains, we're not talking about, I'm sorry, doesn't mean to drink. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shua. Means to dilute the wine. As Rashi says, in order to pour water into the wine, in order to dilute it the way they used to drink the wine in those days, we're talking about, A millisecond. How long does it take to take some water and pour it into a cup of wine? Now, the Gemara, Rashi then continues and says that the Gemara and Dalan and Beis is going to tell us that Kamon Amin and Kol Echad ve'Echad min Chacham Halalu be'atzmei shiur. Each and every one of these rabbis in the opinions that we're going to say are being shiur be'atzmei. They're telling you about their own intimate life, how long things took. Now look at the lashon of Rashi over here. Kama shehu shoye b'ha'arasei. How much each one of them waited during their hara, during their chilas biyah. That is pretty clear from Rashi that what we're talking about here is Tchilas Biyah, and how much each one was waiting in that. And yet, look at Rashi and Dalam Beis. Look at Rashi on the wide lines, three lines down from the top. Rashi says Be'atzmei Shir. Each one of them was Shir in himself, in terms of what his own intimate activity looked like. Says Rashi, Kama Shahaya Shaya Bibi Asay, how much each one waited in their bia, which would then be a very, very short bia. And clearly that's not what we mean. We mean, Rashi said Ha'arasa, which would seem to be more exact. So why Rashi over there says Biasay, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Before we go any further, just to say that if this is what we're talking about in terms of Hara, I'll just mention that the Gemara says in the Darm Chafam Beis that Rabbi Elazar's wife is explaining why there was zechus as beautiful children. Says Rabbi Elazar is intimate and his daima love kamisha kafu sheit. Whatever that means, you have to look in the Baal Nefesh of the Ravid. You have to look at other ways to read this Gemara. Different understandings of how to read the Gemara. And the Gemara says that when Rabbi Elazar's wife Ima Shalom asked him, why do you do this? In this manner, he said, Kadesh Leititin Ene Beisha Acheres. So that was that was sort of the back and the forth, in order to be able to avoid looking at someone else. So not 100% clear as to again what that Gemara meant, but it would seem to be that again it would be definitely longer than all the periods that we're mentioning here, certainly longer than Kedem Zigas Hakais, but nevertheless it potentially fits within the wider Rebbe Lezer. Should also mention the Gemara in Nidal Amud Aleph from a base. The Gemara over there says about the schus of husbands who are shoya, right? Berechem Nishayin is zeicha to Yiladim Zachar, right, to male children. I'm not going to explain any further. That should be obvious as to what we're saying over here is the minimum in terms of arayas, but certainly has nothing to do with anything normative. So that the Gemara. I should also mention that we haven't had a chance to do a couple of these tests, but the top tests here in Kamashir Stiram. So Taisus says that all these shiurim are after Achar Torah Sinner, right? After we take the time to to undress. Okay, continues the Gemara. It's not the pouring of the cup, of the water into the cup of wine, but rather to drink it. And right, to roast an egg. Kiva, to swallow the egg. To swallow 3 eggs. Right, in order for the weaver to be able to tie like a string. Pinchas says that it's the amount of time that it takes to take out a toothpick, take out some sort of a thing that's stuck in her mouth. She has a chip stuck in her mouth. Maybe she put toothpicks in her mouth. Whatever you're saying, you have to remember Plimai. So he comes up, yeah. And Gemara at the end of Kedushin, also a bit of a risque Gemara there about Reb Kiva, Meir, etc. He over there is talking about treating people. Erev Kippur, somebody who was very poor came to his house. He didn't want to give him food, didn't have time. Yeah. person put his hand into the basket to take out some bread. How long does it take to do that? There's not a riot that this is, in fact, the amount of time he has a zecher to this. Where's the zecher? Because it says in the pasuk in Mishnah, "Kibad isha zayna ad kikar lechem." Kibad isha zayna, because for an isha zayna went out for a kikar of lechem, so he puts lechem together with a kikar. I'm sorry, lechem with a zayna to show you that there's a connection between the two. And you want to know how long is his nose? Is how long to take out a piece of bread. Taisus here very interesting. Taisus asks, I don't understand, why is Ben Azai being mentioned before Bekiva? He's a student of Rabbi Kiva, or maybe he was his son-in-law. I think where it says that, excuse me, in Bracha Samach Beis, that Ben Azai was hiding by Rabbi Kiva by going to the bathroom. Rabbi Kiva is hiding by Rabbi Shua, Ben Azai is hiding by Rabbi Kiva. And the Gemara over there said, Ad Khan. He asked to Panecha Barabcha, how long are you going to be a mechutzav to your Rebbe and go check him on the intimate areas? Like this is not appropriate. So you see, it was his Rebbe, and like the more in Samach Gimel maybe it was his son-in-law. So either way, how could it be that he would be mentioned first? So the Gemara says, Taisus says, additionally, how could Rabbi Shmuel mentioned first? Rabbi Shmuel is a student of Rabbi Elazar B'Shua. How is he mentioned first? He's a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. So Taisus tries to say, well, maybe it's the Seder Achila, Shia, right? Talking about roasting the egg, eating the egg. It's not, Ben Azai says it's roasting an egg. You're not going to say first it's eating the egg before you cook the egg. That's how he did it. It's sort of Rabbi Shmuel saying going around the palm tree. Then we're talking about, you're talking about the wine. So first about diluting the wine, then drinking the wine. It's true. Rabbi Shmuel doesn't exactly fit with the wine. When he's talking about going around a palm tree, maybe maybe this is not 100% so exact, not 100% clear to me about how this has to do with the Achil Shia, but nevertheless, that is what Taisus says to try to explain the order of operations here. And then I guess presumably after you eat or drink the wine, so then then you presumably eat bread, and then if you have something stuck, you would take it out. But why something stuck in the tooth comes before taking out the bread? I'm not sure. In any event, this is the suggestion, at least of Tosfos. It is the Gemara. So v'chalhani lamali. Why do I need to have so many different shiurim? I mean, like this is just an enormous amount of shiurim. Reminds us at the beginning of brachas on Beis, right? All the different shiurim about when the ani comes in to eat his pita, when people come in to eat on Friday night, when so many opinions, plethora of opinions. The more later on, the Almez is going to have more to say about it. But for now, it's more like this. Why do I need to have all these different opinions? The Tana Kedei Tuma, because if I just told you, and I'm sorry, the initial part of what we're asking here of Chalhani Lamali is not asking on all the plethora of opinions. That is more later on Dalam base. Here we're asking Chalhani Lamali, as Rashi says, is why do I need to say that when we're talking about the Shir of Stira, that it's Kedei Tuma, Kedei Bia, Kedei Hara, Kedei Kafas Deka? Why do I need to have all of that? Why don't I just say that it's the shear of the tuma is simply say that it's kedei, the shear of steer is kedei tuma, kedei kafas deko. You're done, right? Why do I need to have adding in the kedei ra, right? Why do I need to have the kedei bia? Why am I putting in all these additional points? So that's the thing we're asking. Why do I need to say kedei tuma, kedei bia, kedei hara, kedei kafas deko? The Gemara says we do need to say it. Why? Di'itana kedei tuma. Because if I just said kedei tuma, what's the share of stira? That's the amount of time it takes to mitama. So have amina kedei tuma savaratzusa. I would have thought maybe it takes the amount of time for actually the act to take place, but also the ratzaisa, the pitoi that a person has to do to convince this married woman to do what she's about to do takes some time. You may have to factor that into the amount of time. Mashma, no. You don't have to factor into that amount of time. That ritzusa, that pitusa, all of the seduction, that took place before. And now all you need to have is just the simple rushed act of intimacy between them, how long it would take. And like I said, the Yerushalmi tries to put it down, says you have to factor in the amount of time it takes to take off clothes. If you're in the Victorian era, it probably took longer than it did in the times of the rabbis and in the times of the Chazal. Right? They had a lot of buttons and petticoats and all sorts of things. But The Gemara is saying that you don't have to factor in the seduction. Jalmi says you do have to factor in how much time it takes to take off clothing. Bali is not mentioned that you have to be factoring clothing at all. Says the Gemara. So that's what it had to say, Kedei Tuma. And to explain to you that you don't have to factor in seduction. Says the Gemara, Kedei Bia. What? So it told us Kedei Bia, that's the amount of time it takes for the act to take place. V'itana Kedei Bia, V'mi Kedei Gemar Bia. I would have thought if it said the I'm sorry, I read that wrong. I would have thought that it's just that you have to factor in the tuma and the seduction. That's what it has to say. That's what it has to say that we're not factoring seduction. It's just the brute act, nothing more than that. Now the Gemara says, and I said kedei, so then I would have thought having a kedei gemar bia. I would have thought the whole bia. I would have thought it's the whole thing. That's the time that it's required that they're closeted and cloistered together in order to answer up. The two and have to say they have to be there for a period of time, whatever that period is of a normative bia. Which let's say we have rabbis between let's say a few minutes to 6 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever that time is. So if you're going to say that's a normative time. So says the Gemara, no, it's just the tchilas bia, just the beginning part of the bia. That's enough. Again, what we're saying is the minimum amount of time to make somebody aser. We're not talking about normative shiurim whatsoever. We're just saying the minimum amount of time to make somebody aser, and that is tchilas bia, what we call hara. So it says the Gemara. So now we understand why I had to say kedei tuma, why I had to say kedei bia, why I had to say kedei hara. So now says the Gemara, v'yesh kedei hara, and if I would have said just hara, right? In other words, if I would have just said kamashir stira, right? If I would say kedei tuma, right? Kedei hara, if I would just say something like that, so then have a kedei hara b'aratusa. I would again come back to the fact that you have to mifatu, you have to seduce her. So it's a tchilas bia plus X amount of time to convince her to do it. That's why I have to say kedei tuma. Not enough to just have a kamashir stira as kedei hara, because then I would go back to again the amount of time for a retzusa. If it's a seducer, so therefore I have to say kedei tuma. Now that says kedei tuma, kedei hara. So now I know everything. That it's the sheer amount of time for just tchilas bia, and no retzusa, no pituin necessary. But it is absolutely a requirement that the tuma that we're discussing does not require any seduction. So again, kedei tuma is there to teach you what we're fundamentally discussing. That's the amount of time for stira, but it's no retzusa necessary. That's why it says kedei bia. But if you would for bia, maybe the whole bia, so if it says hara, and now we say how long is the hara? V'kama kedei hara, kedei kavas dego, and that amount of time is going around the tree. Later on, there's going to be a machlokas, and the Gemara, I think it's on Beis. Just double check. The Gemara later on is going to say that exactly how long hara is, what exactly hara is. Over there, we'll get to that later on. So could be this is probably in that machlokas as well. We'll have to dig more about it then. All right. So at this stage of the Gemara, we have now seen that there is a understanding why we need to have a lashon of kedei tuma, kedei bia, kedei hara, kedei kafas dagel, according to Rabbi Shmuel. Fine. So Zot the Gemara now. The Gemara says, for a minute, I'll ask you a stira. The stira is from a Tosefta. So the Tosefta says, the pasuk says v'nisra v'hinit ma'am, and what does the Tosefta learn out? The kamashir stira. The pasuk says v'nisra v'hinit ma'am, right? That she was closeted, right, with a person, and now we want to understand what exactly is the shir of stira. Lo shamanu, right? We didn't necessarily know. The pasuk just said v'nisra v'hinit ma. It didn't say the kama shir stira lo shamanu. It didn't say exactly how long the stira was. When the pasuk finishes up and says v'nisra, she closeted herself up and she became tamei. I would have said it means the amount of time that it takes to be in tama. And what is that? It's kedei bia. Right, that amount of time is kedei bia, kedei hara, kedei chazaras dekel de verbelezer. So you see already some distinction between this brisa and what we just said. Here we're talking about Chazar Stekel, not a Kavah Stekel. Here we're saying that's Rabbi Lezer, not Rabbi Shmuel. And the Gemara is not going to go through that. So the Gemara gives a few more opinions. Right? Instead of what we had before, we said Rabbi Lezer said it's Gzem Ziga Sakais. Here Rabbi Lezer is saying it's Chazar Stekel. Here Rabbi Shmuel is not going to be mentioned. And so we're saying according to Rishua, it means Gzem Ziga Sakais, not drinking it. Ben Azir says it means to drink the kais instead of Rabbi Shua. Rabbi Kiva is the one who says it means Kedei Lislois Be'ah, which was the opinion of Ben Azai, instead of Rabbi Kiva who said that was Kedei L'Gaima before. Now we have Rabbi Huda Maser, I'm Kedei L'Gaima. So now we're adding Rabbi Huda Maser. He says it means to swallow the egg. And over here we don't have the three eggs or the chip or the bread, etc. So now the Gemara says as follows: I would have thought. So then you see why it's a stira. Here you have different opinions from what we just said. So says the Gemara, I would have thought to say, in other words, that my having would have been Hainu Akavas Dekel, Hainu Chazaras Dekel. I would have said that Rabbi Lezer and Rishmol are saying the same thing, that Akavas Dekel and Chazaras Dekel is the same thing. Hasam, or Rabbi Shmuel Kedei Akavas Dekel. But I have a problem, because in our Gemara that we just mentioned before, we said Rabbi Shmuel says it means Hakavas Dekel. Upalling Rabbi Lezer Aleh, and Rabbi Lezer is disagreeing. Well, is saying no, it's Kedei Mezigas HaKois. So he's disagreeing with him. Here Rabbi Lezer is saying it's Kedei Chazaras Dekel. So I can't say that Hakavas Dekel is Chazaras Dekel, because if Hakavas Dekel and Chazaras Dekel are the same thing, then how could it be that Rabbi Lezer is disagreeing with Rabbi Shmuel? It should be the same Shita. And he would be saying Kedei Mezigas HaKois. So that's the Gemara asking now. So how could it be that I can't this havamina that Chazaras Dekel and Hakavas Dekel is the same? It cannot be. So Amar Abaye, Hakafa Beregel, Chazar Beruach. We're talking about two different ways of going the tree moving. One is Hakafa, which means like literally making Hakafa around the tree, and Chazara is Chazar Beruach. It's like sort of the wind's blowing it here, and now it's coming back. Right, you're doing the moving, or the tree is doing the moving. Right, so that's so two different shitas then. So it comes out then that it makes sense why Chazar Stekel is not the same thing as a Kavas Stekel, and that's why Rabbi Lezer would disagree with Rabbi Shmuel here, when Rabbi Shmuel is saying it's Kedei Chazar Stekel. I'm sorry, Kedei Kavas Stekel. Rabbi Lezer disagrees. So no, it's Kedei Mezigas HaKois. But when there's no Rabbi Shmuel to deal with, and his ability to talk about the Tekos, so he says it's Kedei Chazar Stekel, which is whatever that sheet is, that's going to be presumably similar to Kedei Mezigas HaKois. Says the Gemara. Blay Ravashi asked the question, when we're talking about that, it's coming back in the wind. And we're going to see this whole page here has a bunch of arcane questions from Ravashi. Most of them are going to be teku. And one of the things we should have as a takeaway is the beauty of these questions that are on mamish technical, like needles jumping on how many angels jump on the top of a needle, but it's all trying to get at a point in the preciseness of the language that the rabbis had. So the Gemara says, the boy Ravashi asked, Chazar Beruach, when we say that it's coming back from the wind, and this sort of other opinion of as Abai explained, this understanding of Rabbi Lezer's opinion about the decal doesn't mean that you're going around the decal, rather the decal was blown away by the wind. What does it mean? He says, it means it was going and it came back in the wind. Or maybe it just went and it stayed in the place. So we're saying that, is it sort of both ways moving or one way moving? Is that what we mean when we say that we're talking about the chazara of the dagon? So it says the Gemara, Teku. Not sure, whatever. So it continues the Gemara. Fine. So now let's go through some of the other shitas. Says the Gemara, Hasam, Rabbi Lezer, Kedei Mezigas HaKois. When Rabbi Lezer said that you have to dilute the wine, that was the opinion. Diluting the wine with some water, that was enough time for Kedei Tumah. I'm sorry, for the stira. Says the Gemara, Haka Kedei Chazar Steka. Here, right, Rabbi Lezer is saying it means Chazar Steka. So Aidi va'Aidi Chad Shira. Then we must be that we're saying that is one shear, right? Because otherwise Rabbi Lezer will be contradicting himself. If he says Mizigas HaKois by us on the top of the Gemara, and then over here he says Chazar Stek, and they have two different shirim. That would be a contradiction. Obviously, we must say Chazar Stek and a Kavas Stek are different, and Chazar Stek must be the same like Mezigas Hakais. That's how Rabbi Lezer is able to hold both. He's giving you a different metaphor, but fundamentally it's the same short period of time. Finish the Gemara. Now, don't ask me like, oh, was he Mashai like moving the deckle, pouring in the cup? And I have no idea, but essentially trying to get you a very short shear. And then we're saying clearly it has to be that if he used different metaphors, he means them to be the same. Yeah. Finish the Gemara. Hasam Rabbi Shua Kedei L'Shtoisei. In the Gemara initially, it said Rabbi Shua says that it's the amount of time to drink this diluted cup of wine. But here in this Tosefta, he says to pour the water. So that's two different shitas. If you're pouring the water into the wine versus drinking the wine, they're two different. Says the Gemara. Ema kedei limzig v'lishtais. Let's say whenever Yeshua says over here that it's kedei limzig a kais, it doesn't mean literally to just pour the wine. I'm sorry, pour the water into the wine. Rather, he means to pour the water into the wine and drink it. The lema ID v'ID chad shirahu. And let's say that these are essentially one shir. That what effectively we're going to come out with, according to Rabbi Shua, is we don't want to have Rabbi Shua be the same as Rabbi Lezer. But if Rabbi Shua saying in one place kedei l'shtoisei, and in one place saying kedei limzog, it sounds like he's a stira. So what we are going to have to say, says the Gemara. So what are you going to say? That sounds like it's a stira. So let's say that he means when he says to dilute it, it means to also drink it. So if that's the case, then it's to dilute it to drink it. And then what does he say over here when he said to drink it? It must be that he was also saying in our Gemara initially that he meant also to dilute it and to drink it. Now, as Rabbi Lezer was saying, it was enough to just dilute it. And I'm sure was saying a longer time. It's the limzai to dilute and to swallow and to drink it. Now, of course, in the Gemara, it didn't say that. It just said we're having to add to it that it means also to dilute it in order to make the opinion of Rabbi Shua fit with the opinion of Rabbi Shua in the Tosefta where it says to drink it. Where it says to dilute it. And over here, where it says to drink it, we have to say that it meant in both cases dilute it and drink it. Otherwise, it would be a contradiction with himself or a contradiction with Rabbi Lezer. So says the Gemara. Again, so let's say it means in both situations that he meant to dilute it and to drink it. Says but maybe we should just say that it just means that it's one shear. Right? If you're going to say that it's just one shear, then you're going to end up in a problematic state. If you look at Rashi, look at Rashi. On the dilution of what Rabbi Lezer said that was the shita, Rabbi Shua is being meisav and saying no. And you also have to drink it with the dilution. And over here, what we're saying that when he says to dilute the wine, he also means to drink it as well. The reason why you're diluting is to drink it right away. Because if you once you dilute it, it gets ruined. You have to drink it in Masharish if you wait too long. What we're talking about is dilution and drinking. That was what Rabbi Shua was saying in both places. Yes, it's not so clear, but it's the only way to make sure it's not being said to himself, and also not to be said to Rab Eliezer, and also not to be the same sheet as Rab Eliezer. I'm sorry. It says the Gemara, so where are we up to? So Im Kain says the more Hainu Rabbi Eliezer says Rashi the Rabbi Eliezer become Maisa. And then initially said they were talking about diluting. The couple of Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Shua said no. You have to drink it. And in the later Tosefta, Rabbi Lezer says that it means Chazaras Deko came in the high Kedei Meziga, and we said that means like the time it takes to dilute. And if it meant Rabbi Shua was saying that it's just drinking without dilution, Rabbi Lezer. So again, right, the Gemara is explaining. Once we're saying that according to Rabbi Shua, when it says Kedei Meziga in the Tosefta, it means Kedei Meziga and Shtia. And when it said in our initial Gemara that Kedei L'Shtoisa, it means with Meziga. That prevents you from having a steal with the preaching of Rabbi Shua, and also make sure that you don't have the same Shita of Rabbi Lezer as the opinion of Rabbi Shua, because again, according to Rabbi Lezer, that he holds in our Gemara initially, that it's Kedei Meziga Sakais. And over here we're saying it means Kedei Chazar's Deka, and we're saying that the Chazar of the Deka and Kedei Meziga have to be the same thing, otherwise Rabbi Lezer would be contradicting himself. So then it would come out that if Rabbi Shua in the Tosefta says Kedei L'Mozga means Meziga, and Rabbi Lezer is saying Kedei Chazar's Deka, but over here Rabbi Lezer is saying it means Kedei Meziga, then you can end up Rabbi Lezer saying Kedei Meziga here. Chazar's Deka are the same. And Rabbi Shua says Kedei Meziga in the Tosefta, so it means that the same opinion as Rabbi Lezer. So they shouldn't be arguing. That's a proof that it has to be Miziga and Shtia together. Says the Gemara. So Imkain Hainu Rabbi Lezer. So if then we would say that it's going to be the same as Rabbi Lezer. So that's what we say. No, that's why we cannot say that according to Rabbi Shua, Kedei L'Mozga means just Miziga. It means Miziga and Shtia. And when before in the argument it said Shtia, so it means with Meziga as well. And that's how you get out of any problems between Rabbi himself, between Rabbi and Belezer, etc. So again, let's say, again, Amar Rabbi Shua Kedei L'Shtoisei, Hacha Amar Kedei Meziga Sakais. Here he says Meziga. Initially he said Kedei L'Shtoisei, Ema Kedei L'Shtoisei. It means both. Says the Gemara, let's say that this is really just one share, and it just means on a reference to Meziga literally, same kind of Rebelez, then he's going to end up being the same thing as Rebelez, because Rebelez says it's Chazar's Dekel. Chazar's Dekel is the same as Meziga Sakais, as in our Gemara initially. So therefore, in that case, so we would be in trouble for Rabbi Shua, and therefore we can't say that it just means Meziga. It has to mean Meziga and Shasiya in both. So we end up in a situation where, according to Rabbi Lezer, in our initial Gemara, he said Kedei L'Maizgai, and later on in Tosefta says Kedei Chazar Dekel. Those are the same shiur. Rabbi Shua says Kedei L'Shtoisei in our initial Gemara, and Kedei L'Maizgai in our Tosefta. So we have to say that what he meant in both was diluting and drinking, even though it didn't say it. That's the only way to work it out, that he doesn't say so himself, and that he's not the same shita as Rabbi Lezer. Now let's just finish up the Gemara now. So the Gemara says, sorry, I've been interrupted here like 4 times, and it's hard to remember exactly where I was. So Amar Ben Azak again, it sounds like Ben Azak is contradicting himself. One place it says in our initial Gemara, and over here it says it must be that we say that it's the same amount of time. He's not contradicting himself. He viewed it as the same amount of time. In one place, Rabbi Kiva says it's to eat the egg. In one place, it says to cook the egg. So again, what are we going to have to say? Let's say that, according to Rabbi Kiva, you also have to say that it means in order to be able to cook the egg and to eat the egg. Why are we going to have to say that? And I'm sorry. So according to Rabbi Kiva, we have to say that it means to cook the egg and to swallow the egg. Why do we have to do that? Why not just say that cooking the egg and swallowing the egg is the same thing? Because Imkain Hanan Ben Azai is going to end up being the same thing as Ben Azai. Because Ben Azai also said that in one place he said Kedei L'Tlisbeya, and in one place he says Kedei L'Shtoisei, so it would end up being the same thing. All right, so it says the Gemara. I think I have to hurry up here because I've been getting interrupted now like every moment. Says the Gemara. Yeah. So where are we up to? Here he says it means to swallow the egg, and in the Gemara that we had initially, he says to eat 3 eggs. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, he's referring to the words of Rabbi Akiva, the bunch of Rabbi Akiva says that you have to have roasted and the swallowing. So Amashir Gemia is the amount of time they have to swallow the egg. l'chudei delegama shalosh beitz and zuach azu dahaim tzliya ugemia. He means to say it means referring to 3 eggs. You have to tie a rope. The weaver's tying the string. By Ravashi, the merchak, the mekarev teku. Right? What are we talking about in terms of the ropes? It's far or close. Again, take taking out some sort of a chip in her mouth. By Ravashi, the mahadik, the loy mahadik teku. Again, same point. And again, the same thing with Plima. Plima Amrish Tesh Yadal Sali Tolkika, Barabashi, the Mahadeg, Mahadeg, what are we talking about? The kind of bread. The Charatai Batika, what is the bread old, new? Is it the Chamim of the career? Is it hot or cold? Turn the page to Dal and Beit, but the Charatai, but the Sari, is the Chite, but the Sari, is it like wheat or barley? Barakicha, Barakusha, take all these questions are take. Fine, we'll have to stop over here and continue later on.